Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents The Rise of the GI Army, 1940 to 1941, the forgotten story of how America forged a powerful army before Pearl Harbor, by Paul Dickson, narrated by Shawn Compton. So sorry was the state of the U.S. Army in 1939 that had Pancho Villa been alive to raid the southwestern United States, it would have been as ill-prepared to repulse or punish him as it had been in 1916. Carlo d'Este, Patton, A Genius for War. World War II was the largest and most violent armed conflict in the history of mankind. However, the half-century that now separates us from that conflict has exacted its toll on our collective knowledge. While World War II continues to absorb the interest of military scholars and historians, as well as its veterans, a generation of Americans has grown to maturity largely unaware of the political, social, and military implications of a war that, more than any other, united us as a people with a common purpose. Michael P. Stone, Secretary of the Army, 1992. Far-flung ordinary men, unspectacular but free, rousing out of their habits and their homes, got up early one morning, flexed their muscles, learned as amateurs the manual of arms, and set out across perilous plains and oceans to whop the bejesus out of professionals. Norman Corwin, on a note of triumph, his hour-long CBS radio broadcast after victory in Europe, May 8, 1945. Prologue. The United States of America had let down its defenses. In contrast to the 4 million Americans armed by the end of World War I, by 1935 the United States regular army had declined to 118,750 men, which, as Army Chief of Staff Douglas MacArthur noted, could be crowded into Yankee Stadium, and he added that it would be relatively helpless in the event of a foreign invasion. The situation was little improved on September 1, 1939, the day on which Germany invaded Poland, and a day when the United States Army was smaller than that of Portugal, with fewer than 200,000 men. American troops were still learning obsolete skills and preparing for defensive warfare on a small scale rather than for a two-ocean war overseas. Most of the Army's divisions were staffed at half strength and scattered across numerous posts. Their equipment was also obsolete, and their reliance on horses and mules was anachronistic. The Army Officer Corps harbored many not suited to lead troops into combat. In the latter part of the 20th century, many Americans either never knew or forgot that a vast American citizen army had been created prior to the attack on Pearl Harbor. Also largely forgotten was that during those 828 days between the beginning of the war in 1939 and the Day of Infamy, December 7, 1941, a fully functioning peacetime military draft system had been put in place, and that after a purge of senior officers, a new cohort of senior officers was rising through the ranks, which would eventually lead the nation and its allies to victory. What is more, this new peacetime army was given a dress rehearsal for the war ahead in the form of 3 massive military maneuvers in the spring, summer, and fall of 1941, which ended just a few days before the attack on Pearl Harbor. Heading into the third decade of the 21st century, this element in the narrative of the Second World War has moved farther in the margins of history. I base the assertion that all this has been lost or forgotten in recalling the World War II narrative on personal experience. Here is but one example. When I first began researching the extraordinary but largely untold story of the 1940 military draft and the 1941 maneuvers, I mentioned the pre-war draft to several people at a 4th of July party and was corrected by a well-read man who had served in the U.S. Air Force and fancied himself a student of American military history. He was convinced I was wrong and insisted that the nation in 1940 was still mired in a deep period of isolation and could not possibly have mobilized before the war. He advised me to check my facts. The primary question I wanted to research was how the United States had been able to create a well-led, mobile army that was in place by the time of the attack on Pearl Harbor. Beyond that, I wondered how the U.S. Army could have been ready to field infantry and armored divisions, made up in large part with draftees and volunteers, to stand up to Adolf Hitler's stormtroopers and panzer divisions on the ground, first in North Africa and then Europe. The roots of the answers could be traced to events a decade before Pearl Harbor. Henry L. Stimson was a leading member of what was once referred to as the Establishment. Born into a wealthy New York family in 1867, he graduated from Yale and then Harvard Law School. A Republican, Stimson's career in public service began in 1906, when President Theodore Roosevelt appointed him to the position of U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of New York, where he became known for his vigorous prosecution of antitrust cases. Stimson served as Secretary of War for President William Howard Taft in 1911, served as an artillery officer in the U.S. Army during the First World War, and in 1929, President Herbert Hoover made him his Secretary of State. In May 1931, Secretary Stimson, now 64, met with his old friend and fellow New York attorney Grenville Clark, 49. The two men had worked together in the period before the First World War. In 1915, Stimson had assisted Clark in creating the Plattsburgh Plan, under which some 16,000 businesses and other professional men were trained at their own expense to be Army officers at the Plattsburgh Barracks in New York State and other locations. Because of the success of the officer training program, which was in full operation well before the United States entered the war, Clark was seen as an apostle of military preparedness and, by extension, universal military service. During their 1931 meeting, Stimson made a bold prediction that within 10 years, Germany and Japan would join hands in an alliance and ignite a Second World War. He thought that this time Germany would run all over France and the rest of Europe. Japan would run over much of China, and then Germany would attack Russia. He foresaw a 10-year war in which the United States would bear the brunt of the fight, unless a coalition of nations, namely Great Britain, Russia, and the United States, could be formed, in which case the war could be ended in 5. He then asked Clark if he would undertake a secret mission, monitoring the situation through intelligence gathering trips overseas, mainly into China and Russia. Clark turned down the assignment but did not forget Stimson's prediction. After the Nazi invasion of Norway in April 1940, Clark believed Stimson's prediction was about to come true and proposed that the United States establish its first-ever peacetime military draft. After a long battle for approval, a bill was passed and made into law on September 16, 1940, calling for the registration of all American men between the ages of 21 and 34. They would be given a registration number based on a number assigned by their local draft board, where registration cards had been shuffled and numbered sequentially from 1 to the number of the last man registered by that unit. After the assignment of numbers was over, the numbers were printed on slips of paper, which were put into capsules that were then dumped into a 10-gallon fishbowl to be drawn one at a time to establish the draft order. On October 29, 1940, Henry Stimson put on a blindfold, reached into the fishbowl, and pulled out the first capsule. Stimson was now President Franklin D. Roosevelt's new Secretary of War, appointed to that position at Clark's suggestion. President Roosevelt then announced the number that had been drawn, 158. Across the nation, 6,175 young men who had been the 158th man to register at their local draft board held that number. Many of them would be in uniform within a matter of weeks. Many people believe that the United States built an army with volunteers and draftees after the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. But in fact, it was the controversial peacetime draft before Pearl Harbor that put the nation in a position to fight so quickly and effectively. Beyond the draft itself, a key element of the transformation was a series of large-scale maneuvers. The most famous were the Louisiana
Sample complete. Ready to continue?